story. Once upon a time there was a king. Eventually, or pretty soon, your brain is going to make a picture. Your brain likes to fill in the blank. We like working like that. Or we get amused if we can fill in the blank. So there's something interesting. Our brain is actively working. You know, if there's a space, we will fill it in order to make meaning and to keep things going on. So that's one way that stories work. And we compare every story we hear to every story we've ever heard. So what's happening in your mind is that your stories are making a map of reality for you. And this map, every time you get another piece of information, you try to see how does that fit into my map of reality. If it doesn't, two things might happen. Either you get profoundly disturbed, and there was one woman here who told me this morning, oh, in the groundwork team, I learned how to set space, and now you've given me a different piece of information. And she actually said, well, I feel a bit disturbed, but I like it, she said, which was the unusual bit. So we are disturbing her map of the world, but she likes it because she knows she's learning something. But there's that moment of pain. So either what you learn in next to your map, or you don't see it, or you throw it away because you think it isn't true. So the stories are making a map inside of you that is your reality. But it's also either your possibility or your barrier to something new coming in, or you being able to see it. So it makes your map of reality. And so we talk about stereotyping, but actually we're stereotypers. And I can tell you why I think that's true, because whenever I show up, you can hear the accent of where I was born. But I left the U.S. when I was 24, and I haven't lived there since. I've spent 30 years in New Zealand. I show up in Sweden, I have a New Zealand passport. But the moment I open my mouth, people make an assumption about what my storyline is. They are stereotyping me. And when somebody asks me, where are you from, I get a little bit like, because what do you really want to know? Do you actually really want to know something, or you're just trying to prove that your idea was right? And that makes me feel, that makes me a bit resentful. What do you assume you know about me, guys, So when people say, where are you from, I often say, are you interested in where I was born, or you want to know something else? Because I want to know how long of a story are they going to be listening to. So the other thing that's interesting about stories is that none of us is an individual story, and none of our places and no thing is an individual storyline. We're all over intersections of all the stories. So here's Kent, so you would be the son of somebody. Are you the father of somebody?
Yeah.
So you're the father of somebody, you're the colleague of somebody, you were the partner of somebody. These are all different storylines, but they're all intersecting to make you. So it's like we are the intersection of all the stories we hold about ourselves and all the stories anybody else holds about us. So any organization, in fact, is the overlapping story field of all the stories held about it, which makes that an interesting thing. What about Sweden? That's even more overlapping storylines. So any individual place or person or thing is a story field, and that means that there's a lot active in it. So we might be trying to do something for young people, but there's a lot of interacting story field here. There's the interacting field of who they think they are, what society thinks they are, what the culture they came from thinks they are, blah, blah, which makes it very complicated and challenging. That's why it's challenging to deal with, because there's a whole lots of dynamic. And we're not realizing that that's what's true. And our culture is a powerful force field. Like it's trying to, it can overtake us. It's like an energetic, whether we want to, I've not wanted to belong to the American story field for a long time. Right at the moment, I really don't want to belong to it. I think, who are you people and what are you doing? What's happening over there? But, I am also the intersection of all these stories, and stories I don't know anything about that come from my own lineage but are active somehow in my system. So all of this is going on while storytelling is actually very simple. So here's another thing you need to know about how stories work. And so when I'm hearing a story is a way we learn so easily from other people. If you tell me your story of challenge, I can learn from that without having to go through the challenge you went through. Because of this thing, my brain will light up in the same way as yours. If I'm involved in the story, then my brain is going to look the same as your brain because I am experiencing it inside of me. So when somebody asks me what makes a really good story, I say it's the one that moves into your head, sets up a tent, and refuses to leave. which means I can go into the tent, try on all the clothes. I could try on Gabriella's life without having to do your life. And then I can learn something, and that makes me feel really good. That releases oxytocin in the system. So stories make us feel really good, and it releases the hormone that brings us into community. That's why we like it a lot. We love most learning from stories of challenge. So if you want to tell a story, it was a beautiful day, everything was perfect, then I went home. Are we interested in that? Nah. We want to hear something interesting. One of the most interesting storylines I heard, I went to Oklahoma. They had a bombing in Oklahoma where a government building was blown up. And one woman started, we heard stories from people who were involved in that. One woman told us a story of being at the whiteboard in a meeting, hearing the explosion, turning around, the whole floor had fallen out, there was no one in the room but her. Can you imagine what that must have been? And another woman said, I've consulted everybody else I know, and all their stories start like this. It was a beautiful day. And then. So at that moment, you're all leaning forward. And then what? Because we want to know what that is. So we really care about characters. You know, if you want to tell a good story, you need to have a character in it, because we relate to characters. Does a character always have to be human?
No.
No.
Archetype.
You got an example?
Archetypes, different. You caught me there.
A dragon.
Yeah, right, dragon,
so if
or
you look at The Hobbit, you know, what is the
Superman.
Desolation of Smog? Yeah.
Cartoons as well, you know,
Yes.
different
So
things.
it doesn't have to necessarily be a human, but there needs to be some kind of character. We really care about characters. We want to know something about motivation. Why are they acting the way they're acting? So if you want to tell a story from an organizational point of view, if you can pick somebody that's like me but has something happening with them, I'm really interested to know, because I'm now identified with this character and I want to know what happens. And we can easily learn through stories. So that's just a little bit of the basics about why storytelling. It is the way we make sense and meaning of the world. So if you're a human, story is what you live in. So the work I'm interested in is about the story we live in is usually the one we're living into. So if we know we could make a choice, you know, life is like living in a story, so we could choose what kind of story we want to live in. I have a colleague who says the most important real estate in the planet is right here between your ears, and there's always a story trying to get in there. So all of our media, all of our marketing, and all that kind of stuff is trying to feed us a story to make us behave in a certain way, buy this product, and you'll be more beautiful and loved. So it's an interesting thing to be vigilant about what comes in here, because everything is trying to influence you. But you can be in charge of your own story. You can take the power of your story. That's an interesting thing. And I'm really interested in what happens when we look at stories together. So for example, the European Union. At the heart of the European Union is a peace story. That's why the Union was formed. But the peace story is not awake at this moment. What if it were? That's a matter of story activism. That's what I'm calling it anyway. So we can use stories because they're the way humans connect and the way humans make meaning. We can actually use them to help people connect to each other and help them do stuff and understand each other. It's a fast way to do it. So it's an interesting thing to involve people in listening and storytelling. You know, to actually build that capacity to tell a story and to listen to a story is an interesting thing, because you can introduce diversity by helping people listen to each other. So, when to use it? All the time. No, but mostly, if you want to make connections between people, if you want to find common ground and move to higher ground, storytelling is an interesting way to do that. So you might want to be asking people to just tell a story. That's why appreciative inquiry is interesting. The basis of appreciative inquiry is about success. When has something been successful, or when has something worked? The reason that that's a powerful stance is because when you talk about something that's working or something that's positive, energy is released. You feel positive and you get more energy to do something. If you and I were telling stories about problems, which is what people ordinarily do over coffee at work or whatever, we start to get and we sync with each other. So people tend to sync together. We tend to align, and you know, if you tell a story, then I get stimulated to tell a story. There's a term for that in the British Navy. They used to call that ditting. So when guys were working on the ropes and on the rigging in a boat, one would start telling a story. Oh, back in the bar there was and the other one goes, yes, I know a story like that, and it's even better. So you know when you've been in a dinner party and somebody starts telling a story and you go, oh, wait a minute, I have one. That's how the brain works. So the neural network is stimulated. If you tell a story, then I find one. Which is why you don't have to have one when you start. Only somebody has to have one. And if they have one, the other one will have one, because we stimulate each other, and that's where the stories come from. So the brain, as far as I can tell from my reading, knows everything it has ever heard and ever learned. It just can't find it without context. So that's interesting to know. Context equals content. One of the fastest ways to help people find a story is ask them a question. The question focuses the brain in order to make it, help it find something. Which is why the art of questions is really interesting. And that's also the basis of appreciative inquiry, that kind of question. Tell about a time when, ... That's actually a request for a story without saying tell me a story. In fact, it's better not to use the story word. Hey, when was the time when you felt like, or have you got an example about that? That's always asking for a story. So how do you know if somebody's telling you a story? How do you know in what they say?
It was a beautiful day. No.
Yes, they give you a time. Absolutely right. It was a beautiful day last week. It was 8:30 last Thursday. It was on my anniversary. Oh, you remember when we went to
The settings.
There is some kind of marker. There's a time marker usually in order to tell in a business setting that somebody's telling a story. They're letting you know a story is coming. Oh, that reminds me. And then there's ... Or do you remember? Suddenly, you know a story is coming because you've gotten the indication a story is about to happen. That's when you can listen and go, oh, I wonder what the story is about. So there are certain markers to actually listen. So time, place, setting, these are all kind of markers to know that a story is coming. And we stimulate each other. So if one person has a story, aha, then the other one is probably going to have one too, eventually, because they stimulate each other. So a good time to use them is if you want to make connection with people. So often, like the trio storytelling exercise we did is really, really simple, but boy, is that effective. Why is that effective? For a couple of reasons. Appreciative inquiry often works on the one-on-one interview. So you interview me and I interview you. Why I think a trio is really effective is because it's a better balanced number. You can do something with it. And if you notice in the trio, we gave everybody a role. It's an interesting thing when you have a role, because when you have a purpose, you listen on a different level than if you don't. Listening for a purpose activates the brain to actually be engaged. Could you please listen for this, and could you please listen for that, is much stronger than let's just hear one person tell a story. So if we each have a role and the roles are rotating, that means we each take responsibility, then we're each contributing, we're each taking responsibility, we're each engaged. And then the question might be, what do you want to use it for? Is this about, let's tell about some times when we actually worked incredibly well across the organizational structure. Is there some time when the public sector and the private sector work really well together? Is there some time when young people are actually involved and felt really like contributors, and that went really well? Can we find any of those things, examples? Because then we stimulate the ability to look for that.